What happens when Hollywood's most legendary tough guy meets television's most controversial host? You won't believe what unfolds when Clint Eastwood sits down with Joy Behar on The View and things spiral completely out of control. This isn't just another celebrity interview gone wrong. This is a masterclass in how quickly respect can turn to outright hostility when egos clash on live television. Before we get into this incredible story, make sure you hit that subscribe button and drop a comment below, because you're not going to believe what unfolds when these two powerhouses go head to head. Last night's episode started innocently enough. Clint Eastwood, the 94-year-old icon behind classics like Dirty Harry and Unforgiven, walked onto The View's set to what seemed like genuine applause from the studio audience. He was there ostensibly to discuss his latest directorial project, but anyone familiar with Joy Behar's interview style could sense the potential for fireworks from the moment he settled into that infamous hot seat. The tension was palpable from the opening moment. Eastwood, dressed in his characteristic understated style, a simple button-down shirt and blazer, carried himself with the same quiet dignity that made him a screen legend. But there was something in his eyes, a steely resolve that suggested he wasn't going to be pushed around by anyone, especially not on national television. Joy Behar, meanwhile, seemed almost predatory as she shuffled her notes, that familiar smirk playing at the corners of her mouth. She had that look, the one regular viewers know all too well, the look of someone who's spotted blood in the water and is ready to circle for the kill. "So, Clint," Behar began, her voice dripping with false sweetness, "you've been making movies for what, 70 years now? That's quite a run for someone from your generation." The way she emphasized generation wasn't lost on anyone in that studio. It was a subtle dig, but Eastwood's expression didn't change. He simply nodded and replied in his trademark gravelly voice, "I've been fortunate to work in an industry I love for a long time, Joy. Age is just a number when you're passionate about what you do." But Behar wasn't done testing the waters. Right. And speaking of your generation, you've certainly seen Hollywood change dramatically. I mean, the industry is finally starting to address some of its problematic past. The old boys club mentality, the lack of diversity, the way women were treated. As someone who was very much a part of that system, how do you reconcile with that legacy? The studio fell eerily quiet. Even the other co-hosts seemed to shift uncomfortably in their seats. This wasn't the friendly promotional interview anyone expected. Eastwood's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, but his response remained measured. "I think every generation tries to do better than the one before it," he said carefully. "I've always tried to treat people with respect, regardless of who they are. My films have featured strong women, diverse casts. I let my work speak for itself." Behar leaned forward, sensing an opportunity. "But surely you can acknowledge that the Hollywood you came up in wasn't exactly known for its progressive values. I mean, let's be honest about the culture back then." "The culture back then," Eastwood repeated slowly, his voice taking on a sharper edge, "included a lot of hard-working people who cared about telling good stories. Maybe instead of constantly looking backward to find fault, we should focus on moving forward constructively." The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees. Behar's co-hosts exchanged worried glances, but she pressed on, seemingly oblivious to the warning signs that anyone who'd watched Eastwood's films would have recognized immediately. "Well, that's interesting coming from someone who's made a career out of playing characters who solve problems with violence," Behar shot back. "Don't you think that kind of toxic masculinity has contributed to some of America's problems with gun violence?" The question hung in the air like a challenge thrown down in an Old West saloon. Eastwood's hands, which had been resting casually on the arms of his chair, slowly clenched into fists. His famous squint became more pronounced, and when he spoke, his voice carried the same menacing undertone that had made audiences shiver in darkened theaters for decades. "Toxic masculinity?" He repeated, the words coming out like bullets from a chamber. "Lady, I've spent my career playing characters who stand up for what's right, who protect the innocent, who don't back down when bullies try to push them around. If that's toxic to you, then maybe the problem isn't with masculinity. Maybe it's with your perspective." The audience gasped audibly. This wasn't going according to anyone's script, least of all Behar's. But instead of backing down, she doubled down, her voice rising with indignation. "Oh, so now I'm the problem? For asking legitimate questions about the impact of glorifying violence in entertainment? For wondering if maybe, just maybe, some of Hollywood's biggest stars should take responsibility for the messages they've been sending? Eastwood leaned back in his chair, but it wasn't a retreat. It was the movement of a coiled spring, preparing to strike. The silence stretched taut between them, filled with an electricity that made everyone in that studio hold their breath. "You know what your problem is, Joy," Eastwood said finally, his voice low and dangerous. "You ask questions, but you don't actually want answers. You want ammunition. You want to tear people down to build yourself up. That's not journalism. That's just plain." He paused, clearly choosing his words carefully, but the damage was already done. The battle lines had been drawn, and everyone in that studio knew they were about to witness something unprecedented. The legendary man with no name was about to face off against one of daytime television's most notorious provocateurs, and neither one looked ready to blink first. "That's just plain bullying," Eastwood finished, his words cutting through the studio like a blade. "You hide behind your desk, behind your questions, behind your righteous indignation, but at the end of the day, you're just another bully picking on people because you think you can get away with it." The studio erupted. Audience members gasped. Some applauded. Others looked shocked at what they were witnessing. Behar's face flushed red, her carefully applied makeup unable to hide the anger that was now boiling over. "Excuse me?" she practically shrieked, her voice climbing to a pitch that made the microphone squeal with feedback. "I'm a bully? I'm asking you legitimate questions about your responsibility as a public figure, and you're calling me a bully? That's rich coming from someone who built a career on playing vigilantes and killers." Eastwood's eyes narrowed to those famous slits that had intimidated countless outlaws on the silver screen. "At least my characters had principles, Joy. They stood for something. What do you stand for besides ratings and controversy?" The other co-hosts tried desperately to intervene. Whoopi Goldberg attempted to jump in with a commercial break suggestion, but Behar waved her off aggressively, clearly not finished with her assault. "Don't you dare lecture me about principles," Behar shot back, her finger now pointing accusingly across the table. "You want to talk about principles? Let's talk about your support for politicians who tried to undermine our democracy. Let's talk about your endorsement of candidates who've been accused of assault. Where were your principles then, Clint?" The question was like throwing gasoline on an already raging fire. Eastwood's entire demeanor shifted. The controlled anger he'd been maintaining suddenly crystallized into something far more dangerous. He slowly leaned forward, his hands gripping the arms of his chair so tightly his knuckles went white. "You know what, lady?" Eastwood's voice dropped to barely above a whisper, but every word carried the weight of thunder. "I've been in this business longer than you've been alive, and I've never, and I mean never, had someone sit across from me and show such complete disrespect for a guest in their house." The studio had gone dead silent. Even the camera operators seemed frozen in place, unsure whether they should keep rolling or cut away from what was clearly becoming an unprecedented television moment. Behar, however, seemed emboldened by Eastwood's controlled fury rather than intimidated by it. She sat back in her chair with a satisfied smirk, clearly believing she had the upper hand. "Oh, I'm sorry. Did I hurt your feelings?" she said with mock concern, her voice dripping with sarcasm. "Are you not used to people asking you tough questions? Is this too much reality for the man who pretends to be tough on screen but can't handle a real conversation?" That was it. That was the moment everyone in that studio knew they had crossed a line from which there would be no return. Eastwood's face went completely stone cold, his expression becoming as hard and unforgiving as granite. When he spoke again, his voice carried the quiet authority of a man who had never backed down from anything in his life. "Reality," he repeated slowly. "You want to talk about reality? Reality is that I've been making films that inspire people, that tell stories about courage and justice and standing up for what's right. Reality is that I've employed thousands of people, launched careers, created art that will outlast both of us. What have you done, Joy, besides sit behind this desk and tear down anyone who walks through that door?" The accusation hung in the air like smoke from a gunfight. Behar's smirk faltered for just a moment, but she quickly recovered, her media-trained instincts kicking in. "What I do," she said, her voice shaking slightly with rage, is hold people accountable. I ask the questions that need to be asked. I don't just roll over and let celebrities come on here and promote their projects without addressing their real-world impact. That's called journalism. Something you might not understand from your ivory tower in Hollywood. Eastwood stood up slowly, his full height casting a shadow across the interview table. The movement was deliberate, calculated, and absolutely intimidating. Every camera in the studio swung toward him, capturing the moment when one of cinema's most legendary figures reached his breaking point on live television. Journalism? He said, his voice now carrying the full weight of 7 decades of authority and respect. This isn't journalism, Joy. This is a hit job. This is you trying to make yourself relevant by attacking someone who's achieved more in one film than you have in your entire career. The audience was completely transfixed. Some were recording on their phones despite studio policies, knowing they were witnessing television history in the making. Behar, meanwhile, seemed to realize she might have pushed too far, but her pride wouldn't let her back down. "How dare you!" she screamed, now completely abandoning any pretense of professional decorum. "How dare you come into my house and insult me? You think because you're some movie star icon you can just dismiss me? You think your fame gives you the right to be condescending and rude?" Eastwood looked down at her with the kind of withering stare that had made villains quake in fear for generations. "I think respect is earned, not demanded. And right now, you're showing everyone exactly why you haven't earned any." The other co-hosts were frantically trying to signal the producers to cut to commercial, but the confrontation had taken on a life of its own. This wasn't just a disagreement anymore. This was a full-scale war between two completely different philosophies, two different generations, two completely different ways of viewing the world. "You know what your real problem is?" Eastwood continued, his voice growing stronger with each word. "You can't stand that there are still people in this world who won't be bullied into submission. You can't stand that some of us still believe in dignity, in respect, in treating people with basic human decency even when we disagree with them." Behar was on her feet now too, her face red with rage and embarrassment. "Don't you dare preach to me about decency. You've spent your entire career glorifying violence, and now you want to lecture me about respect?" The confrontation had reached its boiling point, and everyone in that studio knew that what happened next would determine whether this became just another heated television moment or something that would be talked about for years to come. Eastwood took a step closer to the desk, his presence filling the entire studio. When he spoke, his voice was quiet but carried the weight of absolute finality. "You know what, Joy? I've been in rooms with presidents, world leaders, some of the most powerful people on the planet. I've dealt with studio executives, temperamental actors, difficult directors, but I have never, and I mean never, encountered someone so determined to be disrespectful to a guest who came here in good faith." Behar's face was now completely flushed, her carefully styled hair slightly disheveled from her animated gesturing. "Good faith? You came here with an attitude from the moment you sat down. You've been condescending and dismissive, acting like you're too good to be here." "Too good?" Eastwood's eyebrows raised slightly, and for a moment, there was something almost amused in his expression. "Lady, I've done interviews with everyone from Barbara Walters to Oprah to 60 Minutes. Real journalists, people who ask tough questions but do it with professionalism and respect. What you're doing isn't journalism, it's performance art. And not very good performance art at that." The studio audience was completely silent now, watching this legendary figure systematically dismantle one of daytime television's most controversial hosts. Behar seemed to sense she was losing control of the situation, and her desperation showed in her voice. "You think you can just dismiss me because I'm not some fawning entertainment reporter? I've been doing this for decades. I've interviewed everyone who matters in politics, entertainment, culture. I don't need some washed-up actor telling me how to do my job." The words, "washed-up actor," seemed to hang in the air like a death sentence. Eastwood's expression didn't change, but something shifted in his posture. He straightened to his full height, and suddenly the 94-year-old man seemed to fill the entire studio with a presence that was both commanding and utterly intimidating. "Washed up?" he repeated, his voice so quiet that everyone in the studio had to strain to hear him. "You know, Joy, I was going to leave this with some dignity intact. For both of us. But you just couldn't help yourself, could you? Behar opened her mouth to respond, but Eastwood held up a hand that silenced her as effectively as if he'd drawn a gun. No, you've said enough. More than enough. You want to call me washed up? Fine. Let's talk about accomplishments. I've directed and starred in films that have won Academy Awards. I've been honored by the American Film Institute, the Kennedy Center, the Directors Guild. I've been mayor of a city. I've created jobs for thousands of people, and I've told stories that have inspired generations. He paused, looking directly into her eyes with an intensity that made her visibly shrink back into her chair. What have you done, Joy? Besides, sit behind this desk for 20 years and try to tear down everyone who's actually accomplished something with their life. The question hit like a physical blow. Behar's mouth opened and closed wordlessly, and for perhaps the first time in her television career, she appeared to be completely speechless. Eastwood nodded, as if her silence confirmed everything he'd been saying. That's what I thought. He began reaching for the small wireless microphone clipped to his shirt. You know, I came here today as a professional courtesy. Your producers called my people, said you wanted to talk about my new project, maybe discuss my career. I thought, sure, why not? It might be interesting. He unclipped the microphone with deliberate slowness, each movement calculated and precise. But this isn't an interview. This isn't even a conversation. This is you trying to use me as a prop in whatever little crusade you think you're on today. The other co-hosts sat frozen, watching this unprecedented destruction of their colleagues' authority. Whoopi Goldberg looked like she wanted to intervene, but even she seemed to understand that this moment belonged entirely to Eastwood. And you know what the real tragedy is? Eastwood continued, holding the microphone in his hand like it was a piece of evidence. You had a chance to have a real conversation with someone who's lived through 7 decades of American culture, who's worked with everyone from Sergio Leone to Steven Spielberg, who's seen this country change in ways you can't even imagine. But instead, you chose to score cheap political points. He placed the microphone carefully on the interview table, the small thud echoing through the silent studio like a gavel falling. That says everything anyone needs to know about you, Joy. You had greatness sitting right across from you, and all you could see was an opportunity to tear it down. Behar finally found her voice, but it came out as barely more than a whisper. You can't just walk away from me. We're not finished here. Eastwood looked at her with something that might have been pity. Oh, we're finished, all right. We were finished the moment you decided to be disrespectful to a guest in your house. See, where I come from, when someone shows you hospitality, you return it with courtesy. When someone comes to your home, you treat them with basic human decency, even if you disagree with them. He straightened his jacket with the same casual dignity he'd shown in 1,000 Western films. But you wouldn't understand that, would you? Because for you, everything is a battle to be won, a point to be scored, a moment to be exploited. You've forgotten what it means to simply treat another human being with respect. The silence in the studio was deafening. Cameras continued to roll, capturing every moment of what was clearly going to become one of the most talked-about television moments in recent memory. Eastwood turned toward the exit, then paused and looked back at Behar one final time. You know, Joy, in all my years in Hollywood, I've worked with some real characters, temperamental directors, difficult actors, studio executives who could make your life hell if they wanted to. But I've never encountered anyone who seemed to take such genuine pleasure in trying to humiliate another person. He shook his head slowly. That's not journalism. That's not even entertainment. That's just sad. With that, Clint Eastwood walked off the view, set with the same quiet dignity that had defined his entire career. He didn't storm out. He didn't slam any doors. He didn't make a scene. He simply left, leaving behind a stunned studio audience and a host who, for perhaps the first time in her career, had been completely and utterly outmatched. The cameras continued rolling as Behar sat in her chair, her face a mixture of rage and embarrassment, clearly struggling to regain control of a situation that had spiraled completely beyond her management. The other co-hosts exchanged uncertain glances, unsure how to salvage what had just become one of the most devastating takedowns in daytime television history. As Eastwood disappeared through the studio exit, the silence that followed was deafening. It was the silence of a legend who had said everything that needed to be said, and left everyone else to deal with the consequences of what they had just witnessed.